This is Willpower.
Like you said earlier, people don't talk about it. They're like, what is perimenopause? Why do I feel so awful? Why do I have such rage against my kid when they really haven't done anything? And it's like, those are all the hormone fluxes that are happening and the downturn of some of your receptors and your body's response to that. So as you become aware of these changes, then we can really start to dial in what kinds of external stressors we need to put on the body for you, your symptomology, and where you are in life.
Welcome to the Willpower Podcast. I'm your host, Kristin Weitzel. Together we explore health optimization tools that propel you from comfort to courage, illuminating the path together to a remarkable life through breath, cold, and biohacking. I've been waiting a long time to have this fierce female on the podcast. Dr. Stacy Sims is with me today, and I get to share her with you. And this didn't even feel like an interview. So stoked. She's such a badass. She's worked at Stanford. She's written a couple of books. One is called Roar. Some of you females may recognize that name. A number of years ago, she wrote Roar, and it really put having the conversation around our reproductive years and our cycle and having our periods on the table. So that made us be able to speak more freely about it. She now, 2 years ago, launched a book called Next Level, which is really about opening the conversation and putting down the shame around perimenopause and menopause for women. It is such a pleasure to have her on the show. And I waited till I felt the podcast was ripe enough and ready and had all of you beautiful listeners to bring her on, because especially for females, although this podcast is for everybody who has females in their life, but trainers and coaches and females alike, it's like a double listen. There's everything she speaks about with the level that she discusses it. I asked her to kind of do a 201 versus a 101. So like look up some stuff if you need to, the basic definitions of some things. And it is also conversational, whereas two women sitting and having conversation around female physiology and how all the ways we have been underserved have hurt us and challenged us. And we are rising and learning more and more all the time. Women have been so left out of the research, and there are just gold nuggets in this episode. Stacy is a exercise physiologist and nutrition scientist. She worked at Stanford. She was with the Women's Health Initiative for a long time. She's almost 30 years of working on this work. And I don't even want to call it work. I want to call it a cause. Because far too often, if you're listening to me now, you're going out to fitness classes at a group fitness studio or your gym that are designed around the ways a male body works. The hormone profiles of men being woven into, from the research, ways that they should be doing nutrition and ways that they should be doing physical training at different times and different of the day and also different times of their lives. And it's all just been layered on top of us as females. So we really dive into female physiology and where where the buzzwords are, where the bullshit is, and where the crossover is, and the way that we do fuel, the way that we do strength training, the way that we do all training. We talk about HIIT, we talk about working in the other modalities that we need to work in to be able to get the right fitness variance, sprinting. There's beautiful understanding that comes with all of these years of work that Stacy Sims brings to us. Circadian rhythm, sleep, nutrition, just really understanding the landscape of what it means to be a woman and how we give ourselves permission. And this is what I want you to listen to and think about, how we give ourselves permission to say, I am worth it. I'm worth giving myself permission to go out and be bold and ask the hard questions and question the system and ask why and find the right practitioners to work with. Because if we don't give ourselves permission to have permission to be empowered, or if you're not using this podcast that you're listening to give you the permission right now to step into your best self by asking the tough questions, by navigating your health landscape, by going to the gym and getting on the gear, getting on the heavy lifting and going to where you might even assume is like, oh, that's the men's side of the gym. That's where people are kind of getting after it with the dumbbells and the barbells and the push plates and all of that. And finding some good coaches, getting some good biomechanical form, so you're doing things safely. Heavy is relative, of course, but doing it safely and really, really leaning in to what it means to age physically gracefully, to stay strong so that you can continue to have the power to navigate your life with softness and subtlety and be with your family and be with your community and do the work that you love. Because that's what all of the things we speak about in this podcast really underpin. Doing what you love for the time that we have here. I'm here on the Well Power podcast with Dr. Stacy Sims, and I feel like I've been waiting for years to just say that one sentence. So thanks for being here.
No problem, Kristin. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
There's so many women that I refer to in the blog write-ups I do and social from time to time that do already understand your prolific work in the world of women's health optimization, athleticism, and aging across all the hormone profiles. And I really want to give everyone else the opportunity to get to know you. And yeah, you do so many things. And so if you're at a party having a mocktail and someone just rolls up on you and says, hey, I heard your name's Stacy. What do you do? What do you tell them?
Well, I have that when I encounter a lot of the soccer moms and stuff. I'm like, I'm a research scientist in women's health. And people are like, oh, that's cool. What about it? I'm like, well, exercise and nutrition. So I try to look at exercise as a stress and nutrition to help support it, to keep women healthy and reaching their potential, whatever that might be. And then that usually ends the conversation because it's either too much for them to handle or they're like, okay, I get it.
Beautiful. And you've been working sort of through Stanford and the Women's Health Initiative and with amazing Women Are Not Small Men programs online for years and years and years, and are just such a top-level expert. It's beyond that, I think. It's like such a leader and a champion for women's health. I think about my friend, Dr. Keeler Osterhoff, who also is like just in the charge of shape-shifting what has been said and laid into with females. I just want to get an understanding of, is there a moment in your early life that you were just like, hell yeah, this is the reason, this is the big why that I'm going to lean into this?
I think it really has to do with how I grew up, because I have an older sister and it's just the two of us. And I grew up in a military household. There was never, no, you can't do that because you're a girl. And so I never really thought about it until I got to when I was at university. And we were doing research studies, and being one of the only fit women in the metabolism labs, I would always volunteer to be the subject. And my results would get thrown out, and I'd look at people and go like, why are my results being thrown out? I don't understand this. Like, I didn't do anything wrong. I standardized everything the way I was supposed to, followed to the letter. Like, you know that my father's colonel in the army, so I know how to follow rules. And then it just sort of came out along the way that, well, you know, women, their results are pretty arbitrary sometimes. We just don't include them. And I'm like, wait, no, that's not right. That's totally not right. Like, I want to be able to be the best athlete that I can. And some of the things you're telling me to do just doesn't work for me. So really trying to dig in and understand. So I went on and I did overtraining and endurance female athletes for my master's degree, looking against the literature, and found a whole bunch of different things across the menstrual cycle. And I was like, did I do this wrong? And my supervisor's like, no, you didn't do it wrong. It could just be sex differences. So it's really just starting to dig in and understand, like, how can I optimize myself as an athlete? And then really going, oh, wait, it's a whole lot bigger than that. So from sports science research to biomedical research, because I've had a hand in both, and going, wait, we're looking at rat models that are male rats and trying to say this is what we need to do in female humans. So there's a whole lot of things that never really made sense. So I think the big why factor is that first turning point of saying, well, you know what, you're a girl, so we can't do this. I was like, no, that doesn't work.
You know, it harkens me back to this story I'm pushing like 12, maybe 15 years ago now, but I did an interview with the Under Armour team for this big VP role in women's apparel, you know, sports apparel. And I went in, and in the midst of it, they were like, you know, it was like John Smith was the head VP of women's apparel. And they were like, I'm like, hey, this is great. You're filling a new role that someone's leaving. Like, no, we're actually moving John into another thing because we just realized we can't just shrink it and pink it anymore, which was like what they would say about, oh, that men's piece is really working. Let's shrink it and pink it and sell it to women. And I think that there's a parallel to the shit that's gone on in the health landscape from women sort of being pushed out or banned from the research for a while for this big shift to change. And what do you think about the misconceptions? It's so, it's such a wide landscape, but misconceptions that a lot of women may still be holding on to around their health and well-being and the way that, we're reading literature and things and recommendations that are coming out for men and then doing it anyway.
Yeah, I know. There's so many. Can I start with the buzzwords?
Yeah, start with the buzzwords, because here's the thing. You have dispelled a lot, right? And so I want to assume that somebody who's caring enough to listen to a wellness podcast is like, hey, I have grokked some of the things. I can talk about my period, with my trainer or with my friends, and they're feeling okay. And if you're not, you can absolutely talk about your period, about all the things about perimenopause, menopause. But I really want to say, what are the buzzwords now that are just sort of still crushing our souls as women?
There are two big things that then kind of tie into one major thing, and that is fasting, zone 2, and not eating enough. So I see that across the board. It doesn't matter if you're an elite athlete or you're someone who's just trying to get fit. We see all of this data coming out saying, oh yeah, you need to do zone 2 to optimize metabolic flexibility. So that means that your body can switch between fat and carbohydrate. Well, yeah, if you're a man, because you preferentially use carbohydrate as a man, but as a woman, we preferentially use free fatty acids. So by doing all that long, slow stuff, we're not actually developing any better mitochondria because we already have better mitochondria density, ability to switch from carbohydrate to fat. What we need to do is we need to do high intensity work, because we see not only as we age, we lose the fast twitch type 2 fibers, we lose the metabolic aspect of lactate production. And when we look forward with longevity, that lactate production and the ability to be able to use it is so important for brain health, because when we're looking at lactate, it's a preferred fuel for the brain. So if we're not producing it because we're spending so much time doing long, slow and meditative and all this low intensity stuff, we are having severe misstep to attenuating the onset of dementia, because we see a huge sex difference in the onset of dementia and early Alzheimer's because of plaque buildup. And it's a misstep of the glial cells. So as we're looking at, in the brain and how neurons interact, if we are producing lactate, that's that preferred fuel. So it keeps that pathway going and reduces some of that plaque development. So when we hear this long, slow, zone 2, really spend a lot of time in that low intensity work, if you are someone who hasn't moved and you don't move, that's great. But if you're someone who's time pressed and you're athletic and you're looking for how do I optimize things, that shouldn't be the bread and butter, because we need to look at the other end. We need to polarize and do that top end stuff. And so then that also comes back to fasting, because the whole idea behind fasting, long periods of time of fasting, or intermittent fasting, where you delay your food intake till noon, have a very short hour or 4-hour window or so, and we're doing fasted training, all of that, again, is for that metabolic flexibility, increasing our ability to use free fatty acids. But like I said, we as women are already there. And we know from the research that we do better in a fed state, meaning that we have a little bit of food before we train. And this increases our blood sugar, drops cortisol, allows our hypothalamus to understand there's nutrition coming in, so allows us to have better adaptations to things. And when we're looking at why, we have 2 areas in the hypothalamus that's really sensitive to nutrient density for women, but only 1 for men. So if we're looking at the metabolic control, hormone control, in men, we have that 1 area, so it's not as sensitive to a reduction in carbohydrate and fasted training. But for women, because of those 2 areas, we have 1 that's really controlling the endocrine system. So we're looking at thyroid function, luteinizing hormone, estrogen, ovulation, all of those things. And the other is appetite hormones, because estrogen's tied to appetite hormones. And if we start really suppressing our ability to understand that we're hungry, which happens when you're doing a lot of fasting and fasted training, we have a dysregulation in our appetite hormones, which then leads forward to a dysregulation in our luteinizing hormone pulse. And those 2 areas start to really interact, and we see a downturn of everything in women. And it's really apparent in reproductive years, of course. But when we're getting into early perimenopause, we're already having such a flux in our ratios of estrogen progesterone. If we're doing long areas of fasted training or fasting, we see a significant increase in our symptomology of perimenopause. So it's like, okay, we hear the Hubermans, the Atias, all of those people saying zone 2, meditate. We want to, really cut back on that high intensity work, and we want to do fasted work. Yeah, that's because they're optimizing male health, and they're very self-involved with trying to biohack themselves as men, but they haven't looked at the literature on women. So we bring those two together, which brings us back to the undereating. And there's so many women who say, I'm doing all of the things and I'm eating 1,400 or 1,500 calories a day. I was like, you cannot expect to have any kind of improvement in your total body health if you're not fueling, because we come from that 1980s, 1990s, calories in, calories out. If you want to lose fat, then you better cut back the calories. But it's like, wait, no, we know that protein really helps because 100 grams of protein is completely different from 100 grams of carbohydrate, even though they're both 400 calories. They interact in the body differently. One is going to really help preserve lean mass, keep even energy, help you create better neurotransmitters and gut health. And the other, depending on what kind of carbohydrate it is, either going to really help be beneficial for gut microbiome, or if unfortunately you're in the States and surrounded by ultra-processed foods and you're eating a lot of that, then it's going to have a negative impact. I want people to understand, especially women, that you need to eat. You need to take up space. You need to be confident in what you're doing and go to the gym, use the lifting platforms, eat in front of people, and just embrace the fact that that's what really benefits women. And it's not the same as what men should be doing.
A lot of times I look back at the people, I've had many beautiful mentors in my life, and I always look back and I've had a knowing that it's like, I look at my mentors because some of them were only people in the landscape at the time when I was young to do a certification, to do a training or a mentorship. And they're all dudes, they're all men. And that's total, I still have so much respect for them, and they're doing as much of their due diligence as they can. But even in navigating things, like I trained for a bit with Dan Garner, who works a lot of MMA athletes and all of this, and he's a really beautiful nutritionist and understands blood chemistry so acutely, and had some insight on women, and really where I started to feed the beast of my own training and then sharing with clients, how am I going to cycle and train with my cycle to build more muscle and do all these things. And I think I did an interview with Lauren Colenso-Semple recently, who's Andy Galpin's a counterpart or friend, and does a lot of research on muscle. You know who she is, yeah? And it was so rad because I was like, here I am. I've been doing this with clients for 2 years and putting far too much weight on that. There is an energetic shift, I think, in women during the month in their reproductive years. So the energetic shift sort of likened them getting into the gym and getting after it. And Lauren was very much like, hey, listen, I'm not saying it doesn't count. It does. I just think putting all your eggs in that basket or so much weight on it is just not really, it's not the way to go, right? And this was a really big shift. I think she was also like, thank you for being open-minded that I'm talking to you about how you have to shift your programming with your clients. And really that spoke volumes to me. And 2 things about what you just said, I want to just get clarification on, which are, number one, I love that you talk about eating, because I'm always like, we never go hungry on my programs. And all of the women that are engaged with me, or if they're my audience, or if they're just in my circles, quite often they're quoting these people that you spoke about, talking about Huberman, talking about Atia. There's lots of prolific minds, and also they're in male bodies. It's not even just a bias in the research, which obviously exists, but when you're a man trying to figure out man things, then you want to apply what the tools are that you get. The 2 things I wanted to clarify, or the one piece, because I hear the zone 2 thing and I'm always like, it's different than getting steps in, right?
Yep.
We got to get movement in our body. And you hear the zone 2 thing a lot lately. So thanks for sharing that buzzword. But I just want to have a good definition from you on what HIIT training is, because I see it all over fitness classes and online stuff, and it's not always HIIT training. And so I want to kind of give the recommendation to women about what that exactly specifically means. Not that they don't know high intensity interval training, but that a lot of things are labeled that are not exactly that.
Yeah, that's the other thing that's out. We put a post about polarized training and no zone 2. And got so much pushback about, oh, well, what do you mean about cortisol? Cortisol is released every time you exercise. Well, yes, it is. But the problem with the difference of true high-intensity interval training and high-intensity interval training that's really just moderate intensity is that when the cortisol comes up, it stays elevated in the moderate intensity and it increases stress on the body. Your body's already stressed. But with true high-intensity interval training, the post-exercise response is an increase in growth hormone and testosterone, which drops cortisol. So like your heart rate as you adapt, yes, it goes up during exercise, but then it gets lower post-exercise, and that becomes the new normal. So that's why I push true high-intensity interval training. So what is that? Coming back to your question. When we're looking at it, if we look at those typical HIIT classes, so of course, I'm notorious for picking on these because I am very upset that they really target women who are 35 plus. So it's the F45 classes. It's the Orange Theory. In some regards, CrossFit Endurance. And they're like, yeah, we're doing a Metcon. But what happens is these classes are 45 to 60 minutes to appeal to the societal idea that we have to go in and smash ourselves for 45 to 60 minutes and come out feeling absolute, like we've been worked over. But those classes don't allow you to go super hard and recover well. So we go and we're on this clock and we're like, okay, every minute on the minute, but people are struggling with the weights or they're struggling to finish the movement within the minute so they don't get recovery. So when we're talking about true high-intensity interval training, it is 1 to 4 minutes of 80% or more of your max with 1 to 4 minutes recovery. So when we're doing high-intensity interval training, we're able to polarize from that 80 to 100%, and then the recovery is 50%. So you have this wide window, and we're trying to target the top-end system, the VO2 system. We're trying to really get that strong stress for an adaptation. And then we need to recover so that we can do the next interval just as hard. So when we're looking at those classes that are labeled high intensity, they don't give you the adequate recovery to be able to hit each interval as hard as you need to. So you fall back into a moderate intensity, which feels hard, but it's not really hard enough to give you the adaptations you want. And it's definitely not easy enough to be any kind of recovery. So again, women are always tired but wired. They go to these classes. They think that they're doing right by their body, but it just perpetuates the stress and it perpetuates the poor sleep and the body fat gain and the inflammation and the misstep within mitochondria. But if we're looking at that true high intensity work, you leave feeling really good, not smashed, but you have more of, the adrenaline high, so to speak, the runner's high. And it feeds forward to a greater parasympathetic response later, after like 5 hours later, which allows you to get into better sleep. And that parasympathetic response is in conjunction with that decrease in cortisol in your body going, okay, I know what that stress is. I can recover from it. And I know that I can do it again later. And then the other part of high intensity interval training is what we call sprint interval training. So this is coming out in the literature in the past about, 8 years as a better means, time-efficient means of getting metabolic control and cardiovascular health. And it is very short, sharp intervals of 30 seconds or less. And you're going as hard as you can, 100 to 110% or more of your max. So you're giving it all for each interval, but you have 2 to 3 minutes recovery between. So we're not talking about the Tabata stuff. We're talking about 30 seconds, usually 20 to 30 seconds, as hard as you can go, and then full recovery, because they're trying to get central nervous system recovery and that high intensity ATP CP recovery so that we can do each interval as hard as possible. It might take 10 minutes. And unfortunately, we're in this mindset that 10 minutes isn't enough. But if you look at the research in women and in men, we see that 10 minutes of true high intensity interval training gives you much more metabolic change and cardiovascular change than spending 45 minutes of moderate intensity. And that's the misconception, because people take these words and try to apply it to a gym-based class, and it just doesn't work.
Yeah, it was beautiful. I mean, beyond soundbite, beautiful of all of that to cover. In quarantine, I was like the girl who was out in the streets doing sprints once or twice a week. And it's just like interesting, right? We find the ways that we can plug these things in. And a lot of times my clients will come to me because I don't say you have to do it as a run, right? Some people just have biomechanical preferences as well.
Yeah.
It can be on a bike. It just feels a little different to pace up to the sprint and might be a little bit longer, and you can do it on a rower. And for anyone who's listening, there's devices all over the place, some of which might even be in your home with clothes hanging on them. Take the clothes off and do these short sprints. I agree with you. It's just not spoken about enough. Or I think there's a miscalculation in women that are like, I had 40, sprinting might be too much for me, too dangerous for me. Do you see a lot of women that kind of show up to you that I have 38-year-old women that call me to say, let's work. Everything is downhill from here. I just turned 38. I don't know what to do. And I'm like, who are you?
Yeah, I know.
Do you have women that are like showing up with that kind of energy?
I have so many women who are like, I don't know if I can do this kind of training because, I'm 45 or I just turned 40 or I'm 47 or older. I was like, well, it's not like I'm going to make you go out in the street and do a 100-meter sprint over and over. We need to phase you in, make sure you have robust hamstrings. Well, maybe you can't run. Maybe we're going to do battle ropes to start first. Mm-hmm. Like, we're really looking at what kind of modality we can do to get that stimulus without injury. And it's the same with heavy lifting, right? You don't ever throw anyone in the gym and say, okay, let's do 100-kilo deadlifts. And let's not look at form. Let's not look at how you move. And I think that's the other misstep is someone will jump into a class and expect to be able to do exactly what is prescribed. And we're not looking at the training history. We're not looking at the environment they're coming from. We're not looking at the mental capacity or the confidence. And once we start unpacking that, then we get women to understand that age is just that old adage, age is just a number. But when we work in the modifications and start getting women stronger, they realize that, they can be 67 and out there doing sprint interval training and lifting heavy, but it's not something you just pick up. So we do have to really get women to understand there's going to be a phase in because this isn't just a training block. This is the kinds of things that we want to do for longevity. So as you're getting older, it's all relative, but it's still very possible for you to jump into this kind of high intensity work.
Yeah. Whether it's in reproductive years or working through and up and older into the menopausal years, if we're looking at fitness variance, just meaning like what you're doing over the course of the week, there used to be like the cardio of Los Angeles, where even I was like, there's sometimes I really love to get on a spin bike. And some days I'm just like, the day drove me crazy. And it's just joyful to be in a loud room with music blasting and someone telling me what to do, especially if I don't have to lead a class. It's joyful. Today I was like, I'm going to go for spin class number 3 this week because I'm just like feeling stressed and I missed the parking garage was closed and then it got navigated over. Then I'm like, well, what gym is around that's like open and has some kind of a class? So I'm also resonating with what you talked about earlier because I'm sure you're the same way. If I go to a class, I love being around community. And also we need to give ourselves permission to say, okay, I'm not going to alternate with the running machine every single other one. I'm going to rest and know that the instructor might come over and say, are you okay? Like I always do like downregulated breathing at the end of my classes. Even when I'm a participant, of course, because that's what my practice is. And then people in the class are like, that girl over there, she's like lying on the floor. Do you think she's okay? And it's just, we need to give ourselves permission to be bold, I think, as women in the recovery space, but also in these gyms like you spoke about.
Yeah.
And take pause when we need to take pause. But I think the question really is that in the fitness variance landscape, what's the variance? What do we feel like the best variance is over the week? Or do you still see so much like cardio out there? Or how do we get women to be doing the right thing for maybe where they're at? And I don't know if that was 2 conversations in there between reproductive years and post.
Yeah. I mean, part of it is our fitness industry is very gendered. Like you look across the board and you see all the marketing from the gyms and stuff. It's all gearing women to go to the cardio classes or the cardiovascular machines. And the men are all being pushed towards the lifting platforms. So we have to be aware of that kind of fight there itself. And then when we're looking at the cadence of a week, it's interesting when we're talking about like younger 20, 30-year-olds where they have more resilience just because they're younger. And they can go class after class and they're like, yeah, this is great. I don't feel tired. And their bodies can handle it. So it's not as important to really polarize, right? So if you have a particular spin class or Orange Theory class that you love because all your friends go to, yeah, you can do that. We call it your soul food. This is the same as my endurance athletes are like, but I really miss going out on my 3 or 4 hour rides and my group rides. I'm like, yeah, okay, but just don't make it the bread and butter. So if we're looking at the cadence of the week, yeah, okay, so you treat those 1 or 2 classes that you love with your friends as a meeting where you don't miss it. You go, you have an agenda, right? So your agenda is socialize, do what you can do, go super hard on the hard parts, go easy on the easy parts. So you own that class and you own that agenda for that class. And then the other times you want to look and say, okay, what does my body need? My body needs strength training. What am I going to do? Okay, so you have a plan. Because a lot of people will just show up and like, oh, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't have a plan. I'm just going to go in and do this. Or they have an app and they're following stuff in an app and they're like, yeah, I don't know. I don't feel like doing that exercise today. But you have to have a plan. So we get older and we get into like our 40s, and this is where it becomes really interesting because for looking from a career perspective, most women are hitting the upper part of their career stride in their 40s. They might have young kids or teenagers. They might have older parents. So they have a lot of stress around what they're doing. And they're starting to get into that perimenopausal state where we're having changes in our ratios of estrogen and progesterone, which then pushes us into a more tired but wired state, and you can't sleep. So if you go to your physician, they're like, you're just doing too much. You probably shouldn't be doing any kind of high intensity work. Just back it down, go for a walk. There is a time and a place for using, and you're very adept in this, using mindfulness and breathing to really bring on that parasympathetic response. Yes, definitely we need to do that. But when we're looking at that high intensity work, like I said, if you are doing it properly and you're putting a precedence on doing 1 or 2 times a week, you get that parasympathetic response. You are able to get out of that tired but wired. And then you put the other, I guess, emphasis on strength training. So we start to gravitate more towards the strength training and the polarized training when we hit our 40s with the changes in hormones. But earlier in life, you can get away with a little bit more, I guess, of what's not optimal really for female physiology, but it's more about listening to you, following your cycle and going, okay, how do I feel today? What are the patterns within my own cycle? What are the patterns on my oral contraceptive pill or my IUD or whatever hormonal contraception you might be using? And you're finding your own patterns. So then you can say, yeah, I know that on day 7, I feel fantastic. So I'm going to go and I'm going to do a track workout, or I'm going to meet my friends and we're going to go do this really hard session. So you start to find that cadence within your life, which helps really build your own resilience and stamina and get better body composition. And we also see that allows women to kind of relax. And so they're not always beating themselves up. Because once you understand your own rhythm and you see where you are across the cycle, then you start to understand that we aren't a linear algorithm. And we have these days where we feel really great and we can really emphasize that. And then we have other days where we just really need to be more internal and take time. And maybe that's the day where you want to go for a run or a hike by yourself with tunes instead of going out and really trying to be involved with a lot of people. So that's a long answer for your question.
No, but beautiful. It's this is the thing. It's like I talk a lot in the breath and cold space just about all bodies in the world having to know what their context is. And the more that I talk about it in that space, the more I'm like, that's always everything. In the gym, it's what's your context? If you're like training to be a cyclist, you're going to train a specific way, right? Mm-hmm. Because and that includes the way you're using weights and accessory work and all of that. And so really understanding, like as people are sitting here listening to this, like what's my context? What are my goals? Do I want to be able to pick up my grandkids and play with them and not get winded and go for like long hikes with my boyfriend? Or do I want to be able to like crush a CrossFit Masters? Or what are your contextual goals? Because that's how we navigate that. And this cycle builds into that, right? Our reproductive years is like, how are we feeling, right? And there are times when I'm like I'm ovulating, I'm putting on my red high heels and my lipstick. Like that's how I always feel or felt, and that makes me want to go out and be like, I'm going to do 2 days this week that are like, maybe even back to back. I'm going to eat a shit ton of carbs and I'm going to go do like crush 2 workouts because it feels good. And just speaking of this workout thing too, because I think the question always arises about, well, where do I go to get these trainings? You have 2 different training programs that are launching soon, or have they launched?
Oh yeah, they've launched, because I would get all these questions, and I used to do one-on-ones, but I don't anymore because I have so much going on. And it's like, I want to do the high touch. So collaborating with people who are in the space, who understand the space, know how to touch women in the way that the marketing and the language and everything work. Because we do talk about language and we want to be empowering in our language. Haley Happens Fitness, Haley Babcock, is a good friend of mine. And she's like, we should do this. We should really put together stuff that you are talking about that's easily accessible. I'm like, yeah. But at the same time, Ketrin Davidsdottir and Annie Torsdottir from the CrossFit world, I've known them for a while, and they, during lockdown, Annie's story is she trained her parents and nothing happened with her mom. Her mom didn't get fitter. She didn't get body composition change or anything, even though she was more on point with all the stuff that she was supposed to be doing. But her dad leaned up, got fit, even though he wasn't completely on point. She's like, what's going on? And then started going, oh, wait, my mom needs to be trained differently. So she's like, I'm going to start training people in my gym differently. And so that's how that part evolved. So we have the Empower app and program that is more designed for people who are very confident in their lifting, comes from the CrossFit background, understands Ollie lifts, has access to a gym and all those kinds of equipment aspects like the lovely assault bike. And then we have other women who come more from the general gym background who are like, I want to go to my gym. I want to have a plan. Or maybe I don't want to go to my gym. I'm set up at home and it's more time efficient for me to be at home. So then that's what Haley's program is. But they both do incorporate the heavy lifting and the phasing in and understanding the body and peppered with true high intensity work.
Yeah, that's so amazing. And it's sort of ripe for the time because even myself, there's moments that I'm like, I'm doing, Brett Contreras' work. I'm doing, all these people are great programmers. And maybe some of them are programming more for women than men. Like I think Brett sort of has a 90% female audience now, and that maybe arc of that has changed. But there's a beauty in the knowing that there's a female who really understands at the depth that you all do to program for us as women, because it's just like there's a security in the knowing of that. And so I really appreciate it and want people to kind of check out your website, check out all the things that you're doing so that they can get a safe and effective plan. I will work with women. They're like, my husband's kind of eating the same and doing some things I'm doing, and he's like getting fitter faster. This is really annoying. And it's just not skipping the pieces that are important because we're like, I don't need to do that part, or I don't want to do those two moves or what have you.
Yeah, I got my husband to commit to strength development classes at a gym. And this is the first time in like 20 years he's actually committed. And he started and I was like, you cannot outdo me in squats ever. You can't outdo me in all these things. And then like within, 6 weeks, I was like, oh my gosh, what is going on? It's not fair. But it is what it is, right?
Hormones. So, it is what it is. Yeah. It's wild.
Yeah.
So here's the skinny. We all know, and if you don't know, we talked about it with Molly McLaughlin, or Molly Easton now that she's married, on this podcast. Sleep is a skill. And in order to be able to bolster our sleep hygiene and manage our health and well-being to the best of our ability, we have to manage one thing, and that is light. How are we going to manage light? Blue blocking glasses. The marketplace is filled with a bazillion types of styles of glasses. A lot of them look really dorky, let's be honest. But I found this company, Filter Optics, and they help me, especially with the nights that I have to be on the computer or be on the phone or be out in an event in an indoor space where there's artificial blue light. These two guys in Norway crushed the style on this. There's amazing styles across a landscape of all of their glasses. You can apply your prescription to them. You can utilize them to block the artificial light, pop them on at sunset, use them when you're in front of your computer all day long, and they are sustainable and good for the planet. Let's get together on this. I know we're all talking about it and we know better. And all you got to do is get yourself a pair of Filter Optics to optimize your health and well-being, to manage your blue light, and to sleep better. It's filteroptics.com. Use the code WELLPOWER, just like this podcast. You'll save $1 or $2 and you'll support my show. Thanks so much. Filteroptics.com.
Let's talk a bit about how we fuel all of this training, just from a nutrition perspective. I don't know if there's like hot topics that you're seeing. And yeah, definitely the fasting thing is all over the place for a number of reasons, including studying with some of your courses. I've always been sort of conservative on fasting. I am conservative on fasting with women. I'm also conservative on the not everyday ice plunging on women. I think hormonal, reproductive years or not, like we just are more sensitive, and I don't never want to deter people from being like, hey, I want to do a 30-day challenge. I'm always like, great, take a cold shower, do something that's less like of a hammer.
Yeah.
But when it comes to food in and timing and all of that, and outside of the fasting landscape, how are we supposed to be eating? You had an amazing email that came out in the last 24 hours. It's like 100 grams of protein, try it, whatever. But let's talk about the macros that are important, the food that's important, and generally speaking, to be like, I don't want to eat too much. How do we unwind the shame and get a new pattern and just go for it with the way that we fuel ourselves, and then what?
Yeah, I bring it back down to understanding circadian rhythm, right? So we know circadian rhythm is how your body operates in that 24 to 25 hour cycle, but each cell has its own circadian rhythm. And it's influenced by sleep, exercise, nutrition, that kind of stuff. So when we bring it to the high touch and we're looking at, okay, how do we fuel? We see in population research, so this is both men and women, that people who eat more according to their circadian rhythm, so they eat when they wake up, within an hour or so of waking up, and then they have regular food throughout the day, and then they eat a meal at night as dinner, but it's not the biggest meal. And then they don't eat after dinner, and then they go to bed and they have a really good sleep, and they wake up, they do it again. We see a lot of metabolic changes where they have better blood glucose control. They have better endothelial responses. So that means that they have better blood pressure control and vasodilatory responses, better blood lipids. We also see that they are leaner. They don't have much of an impetus to put on that visceral fat, which is pretty much a misstep from the liver understanding inflammation. When we have the basic level, it's like, let's get women to do that. Let's just first start with, let's go back to what we call normal eating, where we get up, we have some food, we look at how stressful the day is, we fuel for the stress, and we don't have a massive dinner. We're not bookending our calories at either end of the day. And from the scientific scope, we don't want to bookend calories at either end of the day, because that means in the middle of the day when we have a lot of stress going on because we are living life and we have work or kids or a dog or household things or work things or whatever it is that makes our day super stressful, if we don't eat, then our body has this big catabolic response. So the first thing that goes is lean mass. So we start seeing an increase in body fat accumulation, decrease in lean mass, greater inflammation, poor sleep patterns. You go to bed over full because you were so hungry, you came home, you ate a big dinner, and then you can't sleep. You keep having wake up events, or it's the reverse where you eat so much at breakfast and then you don't eat a lot during the day. You have a smaller meal at night, you go to bed, and then you wake up with small awakenings because you're hypoglycemic. So there's lots of things to understand the lead on when we're not eating according to the stress at hand. So then when we bring it to the active woman and we're like, okay, well, how do we implement training and nutrition strategies around here? We know that a higher intake of protein, for the most part, is beneficial across the board. We see it keeps our lean mass going, it keeps our metabolic rate going. It increases what we call our post-exercise oxygen consumption, or EPOC, so basically an elevation in your metabolism. And it leads forward to having a lot more myokines or exerkines released. So these are little feedback hormones that happen during exercise to tell our body we don't need visceral fat, to say we don't need extra body fat. So it's leading forward to improving lean mass conversations with the rest of the body. So if we get up at 5:30 or 6 in the morning to get to our workout by 6:30 or earlier, maybe a little later, no one's going to want to eat a big full meal 2 hours before they go. That's just impossible from a sleep standpoint, but also you don't want too much in your stomach before you go training. So I'm not saying you need to eat a full meal. I'm saying, okay, well, before you do something like go for a swim or maybe you go to the gym, what are you doing? Are you doing a cardiovascular based workout? Well, then, yeah, we need about 30 grams of carbohydrate and 10 to 15 grams of protein before we go. So that could be some yogurt with some honey in it. It could be, a protein fortified coffee. It could be some protein water. It could be a hard-boiled egg on toast, depending on how much you want to eat. And then you go do your training session, you come home and you have real breakfast. And your breakfast is normal. It could be overnight oats. It could be scrambled eggs. It could be a bowl of cereal with milk and some protein powder and yogurt, whatever it is. So as long as you're hitting that good macros of protein afterwards.
And also shortly thereafter, right? You speak about that a lot because men is the differential in how long their bodies can go before they get that protein. And we need that mass first.
Exactly, because our bodies come back down to metabolic, quote, baseline within 30 to 45 minutes after exercise. So that means that we're not having as much of, or we're not taking advantage as much of that post-exercise window to get carbohydrate into the skeletal muscle without insulin, or getting more protein in for metabolic control and repair and shutting down that catabolic response. So we want to get our breakfast in within 45 minutes. And then throughout the day, you're looking at palm and a half size amount of protein at every meal. and maybe half a palm-sized amount of protein for snacks. When we're looking at the timing is really important in and around training. But as we know, especially from that article that just came out, the distribution so much of protein throughout the day isn't as important as hitting what you need in a day. So we see active women needing around 1 to 1.1 grams per pound of body weight. For us in the metric, it's around 2.2 to 2.4 grams per kilogram. I might have done a little bit of math conversion wrong, but anyway, those are the two guidelines for women. And when we're looking at it is if you're having more of that protein at night, then you're not going to have as much blood sugar responses that might cause some hypoglycemia. So it's really important to get that protein in. So when we're looking at the other types of macros out there, fat, carbohydrate, you want to moderate your carbohydrate depending on what kind of training you're doing, but really reaching for colorful fruit and veg, the whole grains, those kinds of things to feed that deep gut microbiome, because we know how strongly those little gut bugs are connected to things like sex hormone control and sex hormone metabolism, how it's controlling our vitamin production, our BDNF, our brain neurotrophic factor production. So it's really important to take care of that deep gut microbiome. So if we give those 3 big rules where you're fueling in and around your training, good protein throughout the day, and good gut microbiome food, that's a good place to start for women.
It sort of precludes or gives space for the women that are like, I feel like I have to be keto or I have to be no carbs, or I eat relatively low carbohydrates, but I also know and cycle in more carbs when I'm going to lift heavy, because time and time again, I've learned, and you learn through failing sometimes too with your own body, that my body in particular, as well as maybe because I'm a woman, genetics, a lot of things, my muscles want carbohydrates.
Yeah.
And so often we're like, no. And I even interviewing Luke Cook on the show, and he's sort of comedy, stylings of Luke Cook, funny man. But he's like, I want to be clear. I just don't feel like you can, organize the body and physique that you want if you're just going to never go with carbs, and keto is another thing that gets toggled around a lot. I've definitely used it, with clients after a year or two of working with them where there's some metabolic, dysfunction that we just have to kind of titrate it and dose it for a month or something until we can see what's going on. But there's just a lot of that out there. So I appreciate you speaking of carbohydrates too, because early in my days, I was drinking liquid carbohydrates. Dan, when I was working with Dan, he was like, I won't work with you if you're keto, if you want to have a physique like an athlete. And I was like, okay. I was like, I want to be strong. It wasn't like I was just looking for a look. I want to be strong. He's like, well, then you're going to have carbs. And I was like, well, I need to have it in a way that's not going to feel like I'm having so many carbs, because I was so paleo at the time. And he was like, here, you're going to drink these liquid carbohydrates. And I almost fell over. But you know what? I put those in my diet and my body responds like that. It's so interesting. And it's because I don't have, the background that you have, of course, I don't have the background. And it took me time to learn that process, right? Before I really started even coaching other women to go, okay, this is what really works. And there are other things that don't out there. And again, different people, different strokes, but it's just nice to hear us get, again, permission granted, women.
Eat some carbs. Where I had the other way, being a long time ultra endurance athlete, you were looking at 60, 70% of your diet from carbs. So when I cut back on that and started really focusing on functional training and lifting and that kind of stuff, it's I got to put more protein in, cut back on the carbs. And then it's immediate switch of body composition when you're oh, wait, this is how I should have been eating all the time. More protein. Now you're seeing it an uptick of more protein, less carb in endurance athletes. So even as science evolves and we're seeing the perspective within the athletic community, carbs are coming back with protein instead of elimination of carbs and high protein or elimination of carbs and high fat. We're seeing protein and carbohydrate coming into the endurance space, as well as all the other sports that need it as well. So it's been interesting to see the evolution of carbohydrates.
Yeah, it's nice, actually. I want to talk a bit about, sort of switch gears a tiny bit to talk about the whole thing that, a lot of Next Level, your book is around sort of the perimenopausal, menopausal years in women. There's lots of women who come to me in those phases and also ask me lots of questions in the DMs. Quite often it's more private than in comments. and they want to kind of know what's going on and how can shift this. Even a week ago, I was at a women's event, and it was mostly like, I'd say it's 35 and under that were there. And I was like, if they only knew how old I was. And then a second, I was like, somebody on the stage actually spoke to how she fell into early perimenopause at 44, genetic things going on with her uterus, yada, yada, like her medical condition that created that. And you would have thought that someone was like shots fired into the audience. Women were like, oh, she said it. And then one woman raised her hand and asked a question like, wait a minute, can that happen to me? And it's just interesting to lift the veil on that. And then also I think there's, I don't know if this is like a, weaving in kisspeptin conversation or but yes, there's shame, and yes, lift the veil. And we need to be talking about perimenopause and menopause. I did a retreat where I had a bunch of women around the dinner table, and I said, tonight is a social dinner. The only requirement you have is if you're still bleeding, find someone who's not. And if you are not bleeding, find someone who is, and have a 5-minute conversation with each other on each side about what's going on with your cycle and how you feel and your hormones and all of that, because it doesn't get spoken about. My mom's like, I think I had 2 hot flashes. I don't really remember. No one ever told us. So I want to have a little conversation around the perimenopausal thing. I know it's a deep rabbit hole we could spend hours on, but just to give some guidance towards women that are wanting to figure this out, besides getting Next Level, which is your book, which has been out for a couple of years and also is a great resource. What to expect, how to navigate a little more sleeplessness, lack of blood sugar control. I'm losing muscle on my body. And how do I deal with my hot flushes?
And people ask me, like, well, you wrote the book and you do all these things. Surely you were prepared. I'm like, actually, no, I don't think I was. I was like, wait a second. All these things are happening. When we're talking about it and we're looking at perimenopause, the basic is we're having more and more anovulatory cycles. So we're not having progesterone. And that's the Cinderella hormone that people don't talk about. And we see progesterone, it's really important for so many things. I mean, it's tied to bone density, it's tied to blood sugar control, it's tied to brain function, vagal control, parasympathetic response, so many things. So when we start having more and more anovulatory cycles, we don't produce as much progesterone. We don't actually have that much anyway when we don't produce the corpus luteum, which is how, the follicle of the egg, and that's where the progesterone comes from. So we start having a misstep in our estrogen-progesterone ratios. And because we have estrogen-progesterone receptors in almost every cell and system of the body's like, whoa, what's going on? So if we think about all of the conversations people have about puberty and their daughters going through all these changes and mood disorders and fluctuations and heavy menstrual bleeding and body composition changes, we're on the other end. So we start seeing people might have heavier periods, or they might have really irregular periods. They might end up with adult acne. They're having really poor sleep. Body composition is out the window. People are like, what is going on? I feel like I woke up overnight squishy. And it hits people at different ages. Like it could hit early 40s. It could hit late 40s. Some women are unfortunate enough to have premature ovarian failure in their mid-30s. But really, our sex hormones aren't just reproductive hormones. So when we start having these changes and people don't talk about it and they go to their physician's like, oh, you just need a serotonin reuptake inhibitor because you're poor sleep and anxious. We need to take a step back and go, okay, really? Our body is like, I don't know what's going on. I've had this regular cycle of hormones for so many years. Now, all of a sudden, that cycle's not there. And we have to go, okay, well, we know there are different stresses that we can put on the body as a positive stress to create an adaptation that allows our body to keep thriving as these hormones are dropping. So this is where we look at that polarized training that you and I were talking about earlier, right? And we're trying to lift heavy and not do our hypertrophy 10 to 15 reps, because that is not the kind of stress our body needs at this point. We need to have a central nervous system response. So for lifting heavy loads, then we're having this central nervous system say, we need to be able to recruit more muscle fibers at a faster rate and develop more muscle, instead of estrogen going, oh yeah, okay, we need to develop some more muscle fibers here. We need to have a fast, strong contraction. So this is where the whole lifting heavy comes into play, where if we're doing it right, then we are going to develop power and speed and maintain our lean mass. We become more anabolically resistant to protein and resistance training as we get older. So we really have to back it up with good hits of protein in order to get the positive response of lean mass development and to create that myokine and extrakine response to decrease visceral fat. We also see there that estrogen is really good at reducing inflammation. So when we start to have a misstep in estrogen and the amount of estradiol that our bodies are used to, we have more systemic inflammation. So that feeds forward into all of our cells, where now it is saying, all right, we have so much inflammation, we can't actually use free fatty acids that well. But if we are doing polarized training and creating an adaptive response with high intensity work, then that goes away. And so we aren't having extra fat bound in the liver to be shot as visceral fat and stored. We're actually able to use it. So as we start to look at the intricacies of all the symptomology of body composition change, mood, anxiety, poor sleep, parasympathetic activation out the window, we have to look at those external stressors that we can put on the body to create this adaptive change that our hormones used to do. And like you said earlier, people don't talk about it. They're like, what is perimenopause? Why do I feel so awful? Why do I have such rage against my kid when they really haven't done anything? And it's like, those are all the hormone fluxes that are happening and the downturn of some of your receptors and your body's response to that. So as you become aware of these changes, then we can really start to dial in what kinds of external stressors we need to put on the body for you, your symptomology, and where you are in life.
Everyone should go back and listen to that section 3 times in a row. There's so many things going on. There's so many changes in the body. And there's several years back, I had one of my first clients who was really going through it. And she was like, oh, it's rage. It's like, I have to go and walk around the block. And thank goodness, I like to believe that we are a bit of, where we tend to be more aware in generally speaking, sometimes than our male counterparts, which is that someone has that awareness that she's like, let me go out, let me not lash out, let me just go for the walk and be like, what is happening? And so I'm always like, is that coming? I'm whole white knuckling. That's what's coming next? I don't know. I'm just waiting for it. When we look at all these things and we talk about all these symptoms, and there's been a lot of conversation across the landscape. I also was just thinking as you were speaking that, I don't know, her last name escapes me, Dr. Virginia blank. I will put it in the show notes and I will tell you about her if you haven't met her. She is in New Zealand, and she's been doing some studies talking about how sometimes within the menopausal, perimenopausal years, or perimenopausal years even, that what starts to happen is that there's it's theorized with the work that she's doing that there may be a double pulsation, almost like a double ovulation that's happening in a monthly cycle.
Interesting. I haven't heard of that. No, it would make sense. Because you start to have a perturbation of your luteinizing hormone and you have an increase in your follicular stimulating hormone. And we see both of those are increasing. And those are the two things that are responsible for ovulation and maturing an egg. So it does make sense. Yeah. I have to look it up.
Yeah, I'll have to connect the dots with you and her. It's I keep waiting for, she was going to have a book out, but it's not out yet. I'll do that for sure. Because that's fascinating, because I think sometimes I'm like, oh, okay, what's happening? That my period's getting closer together, further away, I'm skipping a month, all of that. And it's interesting to think about. It sort of gives you an exhale in some way where you're like, okay, what was it like to have 2 cycles? Now I'm bleeding all spontaneously, basically. And maybe it's okay that I'm just riding this twice as fast, and I should just give myself a break.
I come from, my mentality is I want control over everything. It's what, and I can't control this, what I don't understand. So yeah, it is a lot of mind awareness and understanding and being able to roll with it. And I think a lot of us have a hard time just rolling with it.
So here's something you may not know, females who are listening to this podcast episode right now, and that is we cannot just shrink it and pink it. We are not small men, as Stacy Sims would say. I talk a lot with experts on this podcast about how we do things aligned with our health and our female physiology in order to make our dreams come true and to live in our greatest capacity. Now, you already may know that I'm a breathwork expert, that I'm rocking out cold exposure, that I have a nutritionist background, and I've rolled all this up into an online hybrid course. Now, what does that mean? That means we are online together in community and connecting, and there is an online course that is underneath the underpinning of this program. But we also get on a live call once a month, and we talk about the important pieces of health, well-being, mindset, and the challenges of being a female, whether in the landscape of business or the landscape of life, and how we can apply these health tools to just rise together. So Warrior Woman Mode Online is out there, and you can check it out through my website at wellpower.life. wellpower.life, and you'll look under my coaching programs. See you inside.
I want to just tap into this. It's a big question, but across the landscape of this is more and more is talked about HRT and just exogenously feeding our bodies, estrogen, things that are going to mimic that. And same with progesterone. You have a stance on it, recommendations, thoughts on it. Of course, people should understand what they're doing with their own bodies for themselves and make their choices. And also HRT, where it belongs and where it doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people think that I'm anti-HRT because I work with the Women's Health Initiative, and they're the ones that put out all the I shouldn't say scaremongering studies, but the media picked up on it saying, hey, this is a bad thing. But no, I'm not anti-HRT. I look at it as a tool in the toolbox, right? So we see women who, I put it in the same kind of concept as women who might need serotonin reuptake inhibitors for depression, and some women who can use alternative therapies and CBT to get a hold of it, right? So we look at menopause hormone therapy. It is not the panacea where we take it and all of a sudden our hormones are back to how they used to be in our reproductive years. It's not designed to do that. Metabolically, it's not the same. We see that it doesn't actually change anything within lean mass. It slows the rate of loss. It slows the rate of change of everything, but you still have to put in the work to invoke actual change. So when we look at menopause hormone therapy, like I said, it's a tool in a toolbox. So if you're having really severe symptomology, you're having severe rage, you're having mood problems, you're having so many symptoms interfering with quality of life, and things like exercise, nutrition interventions aren't working, adaptogens aren't working, non-pharmacological alternative therapies, all of those things are not working, then yeah, reach out. But don't get to a point where everything is so beyond that you're finally reaching as the be-all, end-all. If you are having all these symptoms, it might be that you need a short course of it to get through things, to allow things to settle a little bit, and then you can come off it. There are some women who have such severe symptomology and have hot flashes until they're 80 that they use a little bit of estrogen early days just to get through it. And so when we're looking at it, again, the pendulum has swung from don't ever use it to everyone should be on it. I'm like, no, it's not a don't be on it and everyone should be on it. It's in the middle. It's like, you know your body. And if you are suffering from so many things that you're like, I just can't get a handle on it, then have that discussion. Have a discussion with someone who understands menopause hormone therapy, not your GP, because your GP doesn't have the background that is needed to understand that not everyone needs to start on a 50 microgram dose. Maybe you need less. Maybe you need more. It takes about 3 months to understand what's going on. Maybe micronized progesterone isn't right for you. Maybe it is. Don't know. Maybe your testosterone is bottomed out. So maybe that's what you need and not estrogen and progesterone. So you have to work with someone who understands what's going on so that they can tailor it for your body, for your symptomology.
Yeah, I want to shout out and say that I think also getting recommendations from people that have gone through this and have had good people in the hormone therapy world, because I have a client in South America who called me and said, I'm taking this, like putting this cream on me and taking this pill. And I'm like, okay, great. What did your labs say? No, they didn't do any labs. And then, I've been sent to people as I was having a little progesterone fall off, who's like an OBGYN who's like really fertility focused, who's just was like, order this stuff on Amazon and put a pump on your inner thighs or what. That stuff is happening, not just with me, but many, many women. And it's like, I'm a weirdo biohacker. So I'm like, what does one pump look like? I put it, on my hand, I'm like, one pump. And each amount is different. So like dosage is so important. And of course, that's for all medication, but somehow it's fallen through the cracks that with progesterone, with estrogen, with HRT, it's a dose. I don't know. Here's the dosage. It's the dosage is the dosage. I always say to women, and if someone's not taking your blood chemistry 3-4 times a year and checking the hormones over time to be like, what does the dosage work? How is it working? And adjusting as you adjust, then like, that's not your person. And I see that behavior, let's call it, no judgments on people with letters in their name, but I do see that behavior from people who are like practicing in this world saying, hey, this is what I do. And they're not GPs. They're maybe not hormone specialists necessarily. And then we can give South America a moment to say, okay, maybe she's just my friend who's a client has not gone to a good practitioner, but we don't know what we don't know. And then we show up in a doctor's office or a hormone specialist office. And I think that it's one of the hardest specialists to find that does a good job well. I don't know if you see that in New Zealand.
Absolutely.
It's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, it's worldwide that there isn't any kind of special education in any of the medical systems for menopause. If you're looking at someone who is a menopause specialist, it's because they've gone above and beyond to actually get that education and find it. So it is really difficult to find a GP who understands what's going on. There are a few good GPs in New Zealand who have taken additional courses, really specialize in it. And even they are a little bit in a misstep with menopause hormone therapy because some come from the UK, some come from Australia. There are different guidelines across the world. But the one thing they all have in common is they all do blood tests on a regular basis every 6 weeks on the onset of using menopause hormone therapy because they want to see that you're not getting too much of one or that your body's metabolizing it properly, because there are some risks with it because we know that estrogen, unopposed by progesterone, causes hyperplasia of the cells. So you have an overgrowth of endometrial tissue. So when people aren't given the right amount of progesterone or they're not told how to use it properly, it can lead to some serious side effects. So I feel for so many people, especially in the States, when you have insurance companies who are deny this, deny that, and so they're kind of out in the wind, like, I don't know what to do. It's really difficult to navigate. So that's why I'm like, look, you got to talk to an endocrinologist and who understands women. There are a few people in the States that, I can recommend who do that, but it could be far out of reach for so many people.
Yeah. It's an important pivotal time in a woman's life. I also love that your book is just like next level and that the reframe of it all is really giving women putting the control and the power back in their hands, like empowering people to say, what do I do here and how do I go through these changes in a way that I have more wisdom, I give less fucks, and I'm like ready to go for it and just be able to be fully stepping into who I am. I think that there's something, when you look back at tribal culture, even the women who are the older generation of women in the tribes were like, they were bringing wisdom to the people, And so there's so many beautiful pieces of that. And who knows what they were doing back then. But I think this other notion of 40, 45 plus, not going out and getting after it in a way that is, I also this morning, like lifting weights, right? Just to pop back on that as we're aging, it is all relative. But like even this morning, I made a joke on my social because I was like, I'm not here to judge anyone, but the guy doing deadlifts with 2 10-pound dumbbells next to me, I'm like, are you even working? We don't know what we don't know. There's not guidance. Again, like no judgment. Or, he was pretty young, so I didn't feel like he was an injured or whatever. But I'm like, I just keep my mouth shut in class. But we need to be able to say, hey, what is it? You mentioned earlier just about like it's less reps in some way, right? It's like for me, I'm using like a 5 to 8 rep scheme to be like, okay, good. And I want to get to failure, not in a way, females, that's dangerous biomechanically, but like, what does it feel like to get to a little failure? Meaning that last pull on the machine or that last lift is just a little safe, but a little too hard for you to maybe complete even. And that's okay. That means you're really working, that you've really gotten to the place where you've picked a nice weight for yourself to use and to not be nervous about it. There are plenty of times that I like gut check a weight and I'm like, oh, that was a little too much right now.
Yeah.
But better than the other way where you're like not getting the work. Women I've worked with have been like, okay, tell me what you're putting on the bar when you're doing this like deadlift or squat or whatever. And if you could try to do a little more, and they'll come back and say, I just put like 40 more pounds on, 50 more pounds on. I'm like, oh, well, that's why.
Great.
The needle. Yeah. It's awesome. Yeah. Okay. So beautiful. So I want to switch over to just a last little conversation before I give you back your day. And because I work so much in the world of breath and cold, I wanted to get some education out from what you've learned, what you felt, what you've seen around women and ice baths, because it is one of the big things I get asked about. And people are like, post on social, share with me. And when I'm educating, I have an instructor certification program where I'm certifying all these people in breath and cold coaching, and 70% of them are females. And I know that ice bath research across the landscape is like, there's some, and it's all over the map. But what and how do you feel about it affecting as a stressor and as a practiced female physiology?
So I am an environmental exercise physiologist initially. So I look at hot, cold, altitude, that kind of stuff, and sex differences in there. I gravitate towards the heat more so than the cold because we see a lot of heat shock, protein uncoupling, and all the things that we see with heat. And everyone's a responder to heat, regardless of male or female. When we look at cold, there's some nuances within this in the sexes. So when we have the initial ice response for women, yes, it is a significant environmental stress, but we find initially that ice is too cold to invoke a lot of the positive outcomes that we're looking for ice baths that we see in the research. So I use it specifically for my open water swimmers, for people who are doing cold water swimming, who might be doing Ironman or triathlon, and they have to get into a colder than what they are used to water to prevent that vagal response. Because for them, they don't want a parasympathetic response when they have to race, because all of a sudden they can't get their heart rate up. When we look at for health benefits, we find around 14 degrees C water, so that's around that 50 to 54 degree mark, is what invokes all the positive attributes of ice bath. So it's the cool water response. Women get in there, they're like, oh, it's cold. They bring it up to their neck so they're fully immersed. And we're seeing a constriction response initially, and then a dilation response. We're seeing the brain accumulating that neural response of this is a threat, but still being able to produce the dopamine and understand that, yeah, I can get through this. But when we put people in ice, especially women in ice, they don't get that because it's too cold and too much of a response. They have such severe constriction initially that their body can't overcome it as a stress that it acknowledges the fact that, yes, I can overcome this stress. A lot of the stuff that we're doing over here, we're looking at endometriosis and cold water immersion. We're keeping the temperature around that 10 degree mark because we're finding that that is what really invokes an anti-inflammatory response and positive adaptation to reduce endometrial tissue development, the cell hyperplasia, the inflammatory responses, and the pain and severity that comes with endometriosis. So we're looking at it from a perspective of not holistic longevity health, which I think is the Wim Hof method and probably some of the stuff that you're doing as well with the ice bath and the breathing. We're looking at what environmental stress from a cold standpoint is going to invoke the responses that we need to reduce things like endometriosis and heavy menstrual bleeding and issues that we have with menstrual dysfunction and pain. And then from an athletic standpoint, what do we use temperature-wise to allow our athletes to be successful in cold and open water swimming?
Yeah, so awesome. So contextual. It's beautiful. What I'm hearing you say is that you're like utilizing that water so open water swimmers are not having mammalian dive response, reflex, and then they're like swimming. And then also that, hey, ladies, maybe it's not so crazy if you don't turn the temperature down so much, if you have an ice bath, or just like sometimes you load the ice in the bath and it's like, well, it is what it is temperature wise. The other thing that I think, this is super helpful to also talk about temperature range. It's like women, you can bring the temperature up. Perhaps that's a bit more sustainable and it's also more easily doable for most people. And then it feels like it's still a dose, but it's not so crazy. And you were talking about 10 degrees Celsius, which is just like, I think in that like 45, 48 range, something like that. A little bit 45 to 50 range.
10 is 50.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
I love converting between Celsius and Fahrenheit. It's my favorite. Yeah, playing in that 50 degree range. And it's like, great. If you're feeling great and you want to stay in an extra 30 seconds or whatever, awesome. This other thing is happening, where the daily ice plunge thing, again, I don't want to take away from any women if they want to do a challenge or something. And there's times in my life that I was like blood tested a bit and ended up doing 34 days straight of ice baths. But there were definitely days that there were definitely days that, this is going back 6.5 years ago, which is also interesting because people were like, what's wrong with you? This is a weirdo chick. No one was like, oh my God, I'm going to follow you. This is amazing. I blood tested in 2 parts of that. And I got my period 9 days early, which to me, and that was a very common, I had a very regular cycle then. So I was like, oh, this is not okay. I kind of like committed to Instagram back then to do it. But also it's like what I do now so much. So I wanted to make sure that sometimes we experiment to failure to figure out some things that we may think in our end of one experience, but like not ice plunging every single day and crushing our souls. And I think you are seeing this as well, where we see it's a bit better now, but there's still people that are like super ventilating, over breathing, and then going hard like 10, 15 minutes in cold. And it's like, yeah, like I met a guy at the gym who was like, I just want to get to an hour. And I was like, hey, are you open to some feedback? Even as a man, like I try to educate people on this. at some point you have like a turnover, you may have mammalian dive reflex, you have, this bliss cascade, and you've settled in and surrendered in the cold. Hopefully, probably plenty of people still white knuckling it.
Yeah.
But you have that surrender moment, then like you got to the moment. So maybe you don't need to stay in all that time. And I understand if, like I can only advise so much against things like that, but I just think that's slightly crazy to stay in that long. It's taxing your system. It's like I always say, God love Joe Rogan. And also he would even admit that after 21 and a half minutes of doing an ice bath, because people pushed him after he only did 1 minute and called him all the names, that he was like, oh, okay, 21 and a half minutes, I'm going to do it live on Instagram. So everyone knows I'm not cheating. It's like, okay, can we move on from that? And there is a proliferation of that from that like $20,000 ice bath dude energy, which by the way, I have a lot of dude energy. So it's no slight on people because it's like, again, I want to control the thing and do it all. But there's a beauty about, I think as women as well, there's a beauty about creating and understanding some subtleness, some subtlety or some softness in the way that we are dosing our stress. And like, could it just be like, could we add some play? Could we start with a little bit, more conservatively? And could we not crush our systems every single day in the water? So it's just good to hear you talk about these temperature ranges too, because I do talk a lot about sub 40 degrees. And also I've worked to that. So I'm always trying to remind the instructors and people that come to me to say, hey, you don't have to start with this like gnarly 38 degree thing. You can start with like a cold pool, or you can go into some wild swimming. And, Wim is wonderful. He's given us a lot of this. And also, I think people are overusing that technique just because they don't know what they don't know. And so I'm very keen on training for life, which means we have to calm our state next to the ice bath. We have to get in as calmly as we can, not spiritually bypassing the whole thing and like, freezing and avoidantly, taking ourselves out of the moment. But we have to figure out how to get in there and soften a bit and maybe feel into like, hey, for me, the cold sometimes when I get in is at whatever temperature is a big marker of how much I am actually stressed, because it makes me so present that I can feel like, oh, I'm really being hard on myself, or oh, I'm overdoing this one area of my life. And so for me, it helps bring me into the present moment in such a beautiful way. But it's just nice to be able to remind females that it doesn't have to be ice cold like crazy. And also depending on your context, I do prefer water versus a cold shower, but you always can do a shower too.
True, you can. Or if you live by the sea and you live someplace cold, you can get in there.
There's nothing like a little frozen lake dip where your like feet are in the soil and you can just kind of sit and have a moment, a very short moment, but a moment. Yeah. So beautiful to have you on the show. I always close out with this question, which is if you could pick up the phone and call your 16-year-old self and give her some advice on optimizing her wellness or her spirit, or just how she could lean in. Maybe it's like a parallel to the advice you might give some listeners. What would you, if you had like a minute to talk to her on the phone, what would you recommend and suggest and say to her?
I think there are, a couple of things. One, not doing so much long distance running, because, I did 20 marathons before I was 20. So just experimenting a bit more with other things in life rather than being like in that endurance space all the time. Spending more time with parents, because I lost my dad at an early age, and spend more time understanding them and where they're coming from, what their context is and how they grew up and all of those things, just getting more life stories. And the biggest thing is not to worry about what other people think. Like just really take that confidence, own that confidence, forge ahead, and things will end up being okay.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
This is a double listener for people who are getting to the end of the podcast. Go back and listen to it all over again. Thank you so, so much, Dr. Stacy Sims, for being here with me, for sharing all this advice and conversation and knowledge, and just for all the epic programs that you put out in the world. I'm sure that there's tons of women that always are telling you, thank you so much, this has been so helpful. But in my career, I've continued to look to you as a beacon. And that's my goo gaga for you. It's so nice to sit here with you. So thanks for spending this hour 15 with me. I'll let you go back to your day. And soon I'm going to get a chance to meet you in person.
Yes. Awesome. Thanks so much.
Yeah, beautiful. Okay.
Yes! Thank you for joining us here on Wellpower. You can submit questions, learn more, shop incredible brands, and connect with me at wellpower.life, or follow me on social at biohacking.breath.cold. From comfort to courage, friends, we're doing it. Any foul language you hear on the show is not approved by my mother.